It's a great pleasure to welcoming you to the 2018 GDX annual lecture in the series Big Ideas on Diversity, Prosperity, and Migration. My name is Harold Bauder. I'm the director of the graduate program in Immigration and Settlement Studies. And I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. Toronto is in a dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And I think acknowledging the land and its people is especially important in conversations about migration and diversity that are intimately, at least historically, linked with indigenous displacement, land appropriation, and genocide. And I think we do need to reflect on these historical processes and think about ways of reconciling and addressing reconciliation in this context. Tonight, we will not only speak about Canada, but also Europe. Since 2015, Europe has been in a crisis. Some people suggest that this is a crisis of migration. Others, however, are saying it's a crisis of growing nationalism, anti-migrant populism, and racism, or a crisis of humanitarianism and solidarity. Core values and democratic principles seem to be under attack. In many parts of Europe, migration has become a deeply polarizing subject. So tonight, in this year's GDX lecture, we will address and debunk some of the narratives around migration and diversity. Our discussion will focus in particular on the situation in Germany. Germany has not been immune, of course, to right-wing populism. Although Germany received praise worldwide for accepting almost 1 million refugees in 2015, some sections of German society have constructed these refugees as a threat to national identity. At the same time, on the other hand, we have seen in recent weeks tens of thousands of protesters that were in the street of major cities across Germany marching against right-wing populism and racism. So tonight, we're going to discuss the implications of the current political climate and societal trends on plural democracy and multicultural societies like the societies in Germany and Canada. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to ask Thomas Schulze, the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Toronto, to deliver a few welcoming words. Please join me in welcoming Consul Schulze.
Well, thank you very much. Dear Senator Ahmedvar, dear Dr. Foroutan, Professor Bauder, dear guests. First of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Bauder, and Kim Turner from Ryerson University for organizing this important lecture on a very important topic and for inviting me. You know, I've been with the German Foreign Service for around 25 years, and about 20 years ago, I happened to be consul in Istanbul. I was heading the legal and consular department, and at that time, we were issuing 100,000 visa a year. So since that time, I've always been confronted with the issue of migration, and it's one of the topics I like to deal with, and this is has been part of my professional life. It gives me particular pleasure to attend this event and to welcome Mrs. Naika Foroutan. Both of us were born in Rhineland-Palatinate, in two small towns, only 30 kilometers away from each other. You are now professor of social science at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and director at the Berlin Institute on Integration and Migration Research. When I work in Berlin, which takes place every 3 or 4 years, the Federal Foreign Office is very close, so every day I pass Humboldt University. So I'm glad that we're meeting us here today, but I think both of us call although we are from Rhineland-Palatinate Berlin now home to a certain extent. Why am I emphasizing this sort of more personal thing? In Toronto, my new temporary home, more than 50% of the population was not even born in Canada. In Germany, according to recent studies, around 20% of the population has a migratory background. So we are talking about 16 million people in my home country with non-German roots. Moving from one place to another, migrating across borders is more and more the rule rather than the exception. When I assumed my duties as German ambassador to Croatia in summer 2015, and you mentioned 2015, in the whole Balkan area, many thousand refugees were crossing borders and seeking shelter. In fall 2015, around 600,000 people, men, women, children, crossed the border from Serbia into Croatia, where I was ambassador, a country with only 4.2 million inhabitants. They received food and, if needed, medical care. Almost all of them left Croatia after a few hours and continued their journey mostly to Germany, but also to Austria, Scandinavia, or other countries. Of course, migratory movements on that scale are a challenge for the countries along the route and for the countries of destination. Not every person has a welcoming attitude towards foreigners. There are worries, sometimes even fears. Populist movements in many European countries, mine included, but also in other parts of the world, use these worries, use these fears for political purposes. They often imply that migration is dangerous for society, that it leads to more crime, less security, and even a worsening of the economic situation. Well, let us briefly look at Toronto. Did migration to Canada lead to these developments? I would tend to say rather the opposite is the case. Being a new resident in the city, I'm still fascinated by the transformative power of diversity in this city. Migration to Toronto has certainly contributed significantly to the economic success of the city and of Ontario. How about Germany? Without migration, our economy would not have had so many consecutive years of growth. We continue to be in need of qualified people in almost all walks of life. Migration has not only enriched our cuisine, but has significantly contributed to economic growth. Many entrepreneurs with a migratory background run successful businesses. And you, Senator, were talking about Toronto and the different neighborhoods. And we have that in Berlin as well. We have different neighborhoods, and it's nice to stroll around, to talk to the people, to eat different food. But nevertheless, one should not ignore the challenges migration brings along, in particular if the influx of people is quite high. Of course, any migration needs to be regulated. Without rules, without control, integration of newcomers is hardly manageable. Language training is essential in this regard. Migration goes along with integration. Integration results in more and better acceptance. This is something I very much appreciate in Toronto, the mutual respect, no matter what the ethnic background may be. Only a few days ago, I visited Costi here in Toronto, and there we dropped into a language class with migrants from at least 10 different countries. They were eager to show their newly acquired language skills. These ladies and gentlemen there at Costi already started to feel Canadian. Canada has a long history of well-managed migration and integration. I'm sure that we can learn a lot from Canada, and we need to learn from each other. We need to share experiences. That is why very recently high-ranking German political delegations showed a lot of interest in how Canada, how Toronto integrates its newcomers. Dealing with migration requires close cooperation of various stakeholders. It is not only a matter of interior policy and border security. foreign policy plays a key factor when it comes to improving living conditions in countries of origin. Providing education, training on the job, help to deal with administrative issues is critical. Comprehensive thinking is required. All stakeholders need to cooperate closely. Workshops like the ones today, the lecture I'm very much looking forward to listening to, are so important in this regard. Migration will continue to be a controversial political issue. It demands close attention. Given the relative success of populist movements who count on vague fears of parts of our populations, we need to develop a policy that addresses the concerns of the people. A comprehensive migration and integration policy in the European Union is required. However, not only the European Union, but also the member states themselves must engage in improving integration strategies in order to make migration a success, like we experience it here in Toronto. This seems to be the best way to minimize the influence of populist slogans. As representative of the Federal Republic of Germany in Ontario and Manitoba, but also as a German citizen, I highly appreciate the work of Naika Foroutan. Your engagement significantly contributes to develop a future-oriented integration policy. This is key to a better acceptance of migration society. In the big cities in Germany, we already have a diverse and pluralist population. However, as recent discussions in Germany have shown, there's still some way to go in order to accept this diversity as a given. So thanks for coming to Toronto. And now it is my great honor to introduce the Honorable Ratna Amidwar, Independent Senator for Ontario, Senate of Canada, and distinguished visiting professor and founder of the Global Diversity Exchange at Ryerson University. For the past 30 years, Senator Amidwar has been a tireless advocate for building a more inclusive Canada. She's an internationally recognized voice on migration, diversity, and inclusion. Senator Amidwar serves as a counselor on the World Refugee Council and is also a director at the Environics Institute in Samara, Canada, and is the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council's chair emerita. She was formerly the co-chair of the Global Future Council on Migration hosted by the World Economic Forum and the chair of Lifeline Syria. Senator Amidwar is a member of the Order of Canada and a recipient of the Order of Ontario. Less well known, in 2014, Madam Amidwar received a rare honor bestowed upon Canadians by receiving the Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in recognition of her contribution to the advancement of German-Canadian relations. Please join me in welcoming Senator Amidwar.
Thank you very much, Consul General. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to what I think will be an extremely stimulating discussion that uses language and ideas that may be different from ours. I think one of the interesting trends in the last 10 to 15 years has been how much more closely aligned Germany and Canada have become because of a shared interest and shared values, to some extent, not completely shared values, and we will deconstruct that later, with Germany on issues of migration, integration, and inclusion. And I have been privileged to advise the German government and German citizens and Germany because I have very strong roots in Germany. I went to university in Germany. I met my partner in Bavaria on a hike up the Alps, which I love to talk about. And so, and frankly, Consul General, if Germany had been a country of migration in 1981, I would have been a German citizen. But I hope Germany's loss is Canada's gain. And on that note, let me get to the real reason why you're all here. to introduce Dr. Naika Foroutan, who is a leading light, not just in Germany, but internationally, on deconstructing mythology, narrative, policy, and lived reality in this very complex field of migration, integration, belonging, inclusion. Call it what you may, and I'm sure she will help us. By the end of this evening, I am sure we're going to think about it differently than we did now. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Foroutan and ask her to enlighten us and to infuse us with out-of-the-box ideas and observations. Thank you. Naika, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the warm, welcoming words. I'm really very happy to be here. And now you made it so high that I really have to say wise words. If not, you're all going to be disappointed. So let me reinvent my lecture. But first, let me find it. Oh, this is... Okay. There you are. Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about pluralism and populism today, and I'm mainly going to talk about European societies and the challenge of integration. Right before you came, we had a seminar, and my dear colleague, Charlie Foroutan, said that we shouldn't use the word integration any longer. So, Charlie, I'm going to try to convince you somehow. I'm going to start off with what we at this very moment can really see, and which is quite apparent, and that is that Europe is in a crisis. As Harald said before, we can observe a shift in core values and in democratic principles. And I would like to talk about that to you within 3 steps. I would first like to tell you a little bit about rising pluralism in Europe, then about the rise of populism, and then about the challenges. And my hypothesis is mainly that it is not so much due to the rising numbers of immigrants into European society, but to the loss of democratic belief that we're facing the rise of populism in this very moment. And what we already have been thinking about is whether the rising pluralism is only a pluralism that concerns immigrants, or whether it is a pluralism that also is crossing the borders of gender positions, which is crossing the border of nation states. And we can see that the moments where pluralism is under attack, it always comes together with attacking immigrants, religious diversity, gender diversity, and also with attacking the European Union as a supranational room or realm where the nation state by itself is somehow losing weight. So coming to data on rising pluralism in Europe and in Germany, you can see that we have an approximate data of estimated population of something around 512 million people living in the European Union, of which we can say that 38.5 million are foreign-born citizens. So out of these foreign-born citizens, which are 38 million, as I said, out of 512,000, out of these, some 16.9 millions are European citizens also, and we are talking now about 21.6 millions which are not EU citizens. these numbers, why do I show them to you? I'm just showing them because I want to tell you that it's less than 5% of those people living in the European Union who come from abroad, from outside. Since, if you have a look into the debates that we are facing now, people have the impression that the European Union is drowning under the immigration from people coming from outside as so-called invaders of the European Union. So the migration topic has somehow become an obsession in European societies, and this obsession is covering a lot of major issues that we have to talk about later. And I will show you on the course of my lecture that these kinds of ideas of the countries being invaded is also been risen in countries where you have hardly any migration. And this is what we want to talk about, that it is, or it might be, mainly some ideas about national identity changing, or about the impression that people do not know who is where they belong to any longer. But this is another debate that I had in my talk before. But I'm going to, maybe we can talk about that in our discussion. So what we still have to acknowledge is, and this is what you, Councillor Schulze, pointed out, that we had faced a debate of an entry of refugees in 2015 with high rising numbers of asylum applications. So if you have a look at these slides, you can see that for years we had a quite stable line of asylum applications to Europe that has increased in 2015 rapidly and now is decreasing rapidly again because of the closure of the borders, because of the deal with Turkey, and so on and so forth. In any case, we know that within the last year there were only less than 100,000 refugees applying for asylum in Germany, compared to nearly 1 million in 2015. So we can really say that there has been a rise, but there is also a decline. And what we also have to know and have to acknowledge that when we are talking about the refugees coming to Europe, we're always thinking about a huge burden that Europe is facing. But we know that the numbers of those who finally reach the European ground are far less than those who are on their way. If you have a look at this slide, you can see that we're talking about more than, if you just count all the numbers, 40 million, 25 million, and 3.1 million, so you reach some 17 million people who are on their way trying to leave their countries. We know that 85% of them go into countries that are close to them, and they mainly go into underdeveloped countries, as we call it, like that. And it's really a very, very small amount that reach Europe in the end. If you have a look at the 5 countries that are those countries who host the highest numbers of migration, you will see Turkey on the first side. And then you will see Uganda, Pakistan, Lebanon, and Iran. There's no European country within them, but still talking about the numbers. Since 2015, we had some 2.5 million refugees coming to Europe. Think about this number, 2.5 million. We have huge debates about that. We have rising anti-immigrant sentiments. We have rising populist parties on this number of 2.5 million. And then have a look at the numbers of Turkey, which is nearly I can't see it from here, but it's something like 3 million. So you can see there is one country, Turkey, that has received more immigrants than the whole European Union countries together, which are 28 countries. And we're facing real debates about Turkey in terms of democratization, but there's no talk about immigration. So something is happening with this code on migration that we have to deconstruct. Indeed, as I said before, there has been a rise in asylum claims, but most of the asylum claims were made in Germany. This is what the Consul said before. So having a look at these data, you can see that more than 1.2 million asylum claims have been made between 2015 and 2016. And if you compare that to other countries on this slide, you will see that there are countries who have far less, like, for example, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. All these countries now are very much concerned about immigration. So having the data on Poland, we know that Poland has accepted some 10 to 12,000 refugees, but the right-wing populist party has managed to win elections on the on the idea of losing national identity because of immigration. Same with Czechoslovakia, Hungary, same with Slovenia. So this is something what I would want to have you in your mind in your, when we're talking later in the debate, that you don't need the numbers, and you don't need empirical reality if you want to construct a narrative that is anti-whatsoever. It is enough to construct a narrative and to bring in the fear in order to be able to make politics. I can show that to you with some really clear quotes that make it a little bit more visible for you how the reactions in Europe towards immigration and towards the influx of refugees has been. I can show it to you, and I call it the fear of small numbers, according to some others who are working on that. And I'm showing you some quotes of prime ministers within the term, concerning the data and concerning the debate on immigration to their countries. This is a quote of Prime Minister Fico, who was Prime Minister of Slovenia during that time, and he had faced, just have that in mind, 145 refugees coming to his country. Although, okay, the country is small, it's 5 million people living there, but 145 is less than 0.2%. Still, what he was saying in public debates was, I do not wish there were tens of thousands of Muslims. The problem is not, I quote, that they were coming, but they are changing the character of the country. 145 people. We do, I quote, we do not want to change the traditions of the country, which is built on Constantine Methodist tradition. And I'm sorry, Islam has no place in Slovakia. I think it is the duty of politicians to talk about these things very clearly and openly. And this claim of talking clearly and openly is something which is also very much connected to being anti-immigrant. Finally, there's someone saying it. And we know that these debates are somehow within the European realm. They have been brought in not only by political parties from the right, but they also have been connecting very well to claims of social democratic parties and also to conservative parties with no real populist agenda, but they connected well to it. So what we also can see, and what I showed you before, is that the rise of right-wing populism, as I said, we could also face that already before the so-called refugee crisis to Europe. And what we also do know is that what you can see on the left-hand side is the political parties that gain being voted into and coming into the parliament. But on the right side, you can see that it's even more if you just ask the people of their authoritarian views. So having also a look at Poland, we can see that nearly 80% would be in favor or would be according to authoritarian rules when it comes to the ideas of not only migration but also gender, LGBTQ rights, and so on and so forth. And what we also do know is that a lot of these debates are connected to Islamophobia or to anti-Muslim racism. It seems somehow that this idea of pluralism, that is a kind of an amorph idea, you can't really grab it. Pluralism is a word, but it's also a code. And as I mentioned to you before, if we say that pluralism is somehow rooted into the democratic constitutions, still it remains abstract. So the European Union with 28 countries, in the end, is an abstract room. And gender constructions or LGBTQ moments somehow bring in the pluralism issue into the embodiment of persons. So suddenly you can see that there is someone in between. If you have a transgender person in front of you, this is the embodiment of pluralism. This is the embodiment of crossing borders. And this is the same what happens with migration. So migrants embody and incarnate pluralization. And this might be the moment that we can somehow explain by the attacks that we can see. As a German politician said in a very good example, he said, you can hit immigrants when you see them on the road, but it's very difficult to hit the European Union. So there you see, this is maybe a moment where we try to explain or to figurize the pluralism issue into concrete personals. And so what we have seen is that a lot of these debates somehow transform from anti-immigrant debates into anti-Muslim debates, and also are connected to a lot of idea on data. The idea of making up high numbers where empirically there is not is something that has to be deconstructed, because if we deconstruct the number, we can understand what is lying underneath. So there are studies that show that there is an overestimation of the Muslim population in a lot of countries worldwide. You can see, for example, France scoring highest, thinking that every third person of their country would be a Muslim, while I don't know, in fact, what it is, but I even don't care, because this is not what I want to show you. You know, people think it's so much, but in reality, it's that much, so this is not so bad. I just want to show you that because of the debates concerning Islam and Muslims, in a lot of countries, people tend to think alarmingly big numbers and to produce alarmingly big numbers into these groups. Why? Because these numbers are connected to the idea of invasion, and they are connected to the idea of these people coming in as hidden agents in order to be more and more and more through fertilizations and then take away your country in the end. So this is something which is very much connected to the numbers. And in fact, even if you go out telling the people the right numbers, this won't change the narrative. It will not change the narrative. We did a study like this in Germany, asking people to estimate the numbers of Muslims living there. In fact, for you to know, it's 5%. And we had overestimations like it's 25%, 30%, some even saying it's 50%, so every second person. And so even though this number is well known, actually, this number is nearly in every newspaper, nearly every day. So you could know if you want to know. It's not about knowledge. And this is what is very difficult for us and social scientists to accept, that we have to get out working on different manners. So we come very much from empirical studies. Normally, we were used to the moment that when we turned out telling people about facts and about data, they started nodding, and they started believing us. But now it's like we come out, we present data, and they say, oh, one wise guy, I don't know whether it was Churchill or Lenin, said, don't trust any data you haven't manipulated yourself. So this is like they want to tell you this data must be manipulated if it's like that. And even I think I've got the Canadian numbers there too, which is also an overestimation of, I don't know, 11% or something like that. I can leave you the slides so you can look that up later if you want yourself. Okay, so one other, yes. So I started with the idea of the numbers compared to no numbers. I showed you that there are countries where you have hardly any immigration, but you have high right-wing populist parties and arguments of losing identity, losing control, being invaded, and so on. And then there is another very irritating moment that we're all facing, and I'm sure you face that too in your debates, if you debate about that, that there is one major argument that is made, and that says that the rise of right-wing populism is due to real problems that these people have, and that we have to take their problems serious, and that we have to have an ear for their real problems. And so all us, the liberal people, come out and we tell them about what their real problem is. Oh, I'm sure you're not a racist and you're not you don't have anti-Muslim sentiments. You're just saying that because you fear of losing your job. Or you're saying that because, I don't know, you don't have any train station in your small city and you don't know how to get to the center of the city. Or you're doing that because, I don't know, all women left your town and now it's all males sitting there. Actually, these are all real arguments I'm saying that we had in the public debate. So we try to understand that mainly through explaining it by loss of status and by economic fear. But then if we have a look at the empirical data, we can see that people who tend to say in high numbers that the highest fear that they have is about refugees and foreigners, if we ask them if they are afraid or if they want more social justice, it's only 16% who would say yes. And if we ask them about education and schools as a major problem, it's only 13%. Or if we ask them about jobs, look that up, it's only 8% who would say they're afraid of losing their jobs or they care about better jobs. So there is again this mismatch that obviously it seems that we have to dig deeper, that we have to ask ourselves what comes when all our economic arguments don't get to explain really why these is on the rise. I mean, this argument is a very neo-Marxistic one, which always says in countries where you have a loss of economic status, you have a rise of racism. So I want to point out for you, for those who are not familiar with the European countries, that we have major rises in right-wing populism for years in countries like Switzerland, which you might know is, I think, one of the richest countries in the world. We have that in Sweden, in Norway, in Austria. We have that in Germany. We have that in the UK. So we have the rise in all those wealthy countries. And as to Germany, you should know that Germany, for now, has the highest economic position compared since World War II, within the last 10 years, explicitly since the beginning of the financial crisis. So again, there is this mismatch. The country is very well off, and it's facing high numbers of right-wing populism. And in fact, you're also familiar with that, Consul Schulze. Within the last years, the number of immigrants is constantly going down, while the votes for right-wing parties is constantly rising. So this argument that the parties were making up, and I mean, we've got the AfD, the right-wing populist party, higher than the Social Democrats now, on 16%, and the Social Democrats on 14%. So you can see that even with declining numbers, and I think this is the major failure of politics within the last years, people connected the rise of right-wing populism to this rising migration, and therefore did everything in order to get migration reduced, thinking that with the reduction of this fact, they would also reduce or gain back the voters from before. But what happened, in fact, was that the whole public discourse has shifted towards the right. And then there is one other interesting thing that I wanted to show you, also to somehow deconstruct our ideas about racism and about where this all comes from. Because another moment of understanding within the past years has been that the voters for right-wing populist parties are mainly coming out of the labor class. So it's white working class, poor people who are voting for them. It's like the debate a little bit around the voting for Trump, where they said it's the Rust Belt voters who are those who mainly support. So we had already the data for the AfD voters before that, and we could see that more than 50% of them are gaining €3,000 per month, which is far above the median. We know that there is a high rate of academics. We know it is the party with the highest amount of professors in their lines and journalists. So it is a party that has evolved from academic thoughts and academic ideas, and it connects very well to public sentiments. And this is, I think, what we should have in mind when we, it's always difficult to compare history, but you know, normally we had this moment where elite and the population, they do not communicate directly together. I don't know how it is in Canada. But normally you have an intermediate. The intermediate is, for example, the academia or journalists. So the elite, the public, the political elite communicates with the journalists communicate to the public. Normally you have different instances, or they communicate, for example, through administration. And there, where you have the elite directly communicating with the population, there is a lot of moments for manipulation. We had a direct communication like that in the moment of the rising National Socialism. So there was a direct communication by eliminating the elite in the middle. And now we can see that again, extremely intelligent, extremely smart and strategic right-wing people communicating against journalism. We have now a real mistrust in journalism since these parties arise. Communicating against journalism, communicating against academia, priming them as elite that cannot communicate to the folk, to the people, and bringing themselves in as great communicators and bringing in their own images of society. Okay. This is my last slide before I get into the challenges for integration. Again, one of these slides to show you about the fears, about the real fears of the people. Because, you know, you can see that you have every second person, or more than every second person, saying that they fear that Islam will become too influential in Germany. If you have a look at the one above, this is mainly what I told you before, that they do not fear so much that they could compete with them on the labor market, which is a social democrat argument, you know. I don't know whether you have that here too, but there is very much about, like, liberals failed because liberals have all those ideas of multicultural societies and don't connect to the poor working class labor people. Why? Because, of course, they can welcome immigrants because these immigrants do not compete with them on the labor market. They compete with the working poor. And actually, I mean, I don't know for your job market, but we have a big job market for working poor people where we can't even not find people to work there. So the competition line is not that one that we can actually hold on. Of course, this might be one argument, but even though asking, this is all about population surveys in Germany, you can also see people will not think that they compete. They think other things, like they think they bring in diseases, or they think they rape my daughter, or they think they will bring their cruel religious ideas and kick away democracy, while at the same time right-wing populist parties are eroding democracy throughout Europe. So this is the ambivalent situation we're facing throughout Europe. And now asking about challenges for integration. And what I wanted to show you, because, you know, actually, if I'm talking about anti-Muslim sentiments, you might think that this can be one sentiment, okay? Sentiments do not effectively have to change things. This is why I would like to show you within the next slides how these sentiments concretely affect disintegration, or concretely somehow affect people's life or Muslim lives in Germany. So I would like to draw your attention on some surveys and some experimental designs, because I told you I'm working empirically mainly. And this is what one of my colleagues did. She handed in 1,500 fictive job applications to companies, and then she analyzed the responses from HR. And she always handed in the same applications, but she changed the photo. It's even the same woman, as you can see. But the woman has changed her name. Once her name is Sandra Bauer, which is a quite typical German name. And then she gave her the name Meryem Öztürk, which is a Turkish name. And then in the third picture, Meryem Öztürk is wearing a headscarf. So as you can see on this bar chart here, you can see the invitations declining if you correlate it with the names and, of course, with the headscarf. So the woman with the headscarf is the one who has not been invited as often as the others, as you can see, while at the very same time, if you ask into German companies and into the German society, there is a very, very big narrative of Germany being a meritocratic country. That means a country that has based its decisions on qualification. So we cannot be racist because we decide on the qualification of people. And if there are no women in our companies, it's because they are not as qualified as men are. It's not because we don't know about things like that, but it is always connected to the idea of qualification. So indeed, in fact, we only have 30% women in our parliament this year. And we have our Minister of Interiors setting up his team and bringing up a photo where he said, finally, my team is here. And his team, his team is 8 white men. No woman, no person of color, no nothing. It's that, and then, it's the question of people coming out, because we had a big debate about Islam belonging to Germany, and because this Minister of Interior said, well, he thinks Islam does not belong to Germany. After this photo, we had a lot of debates on Twitter where people asking, oh, do women do not belong to Germany either? So this is debates we're facing now, and I think for the Canadian case, they might be kind of funny. But actually, this is where we are at this very moment. So this is about the idea, the self-perception of being a meritocratic country, and of the idea of basing your decisions on qualifications. Same thing is when we look at transition into vocational training, for example. Here you can also compare what changes if you have the wrong name. The wrong name means a name of a person with a migration background, or even worse, if you have a Turkish or Arabic names. There you can see also the declining bar charts concerning your invitation for vocational training. And I would like to draw your attention on one of these bar charts, which is the turquoise one, because I think this is explicitly depressing. Because there you can see, and this is also about our narratives, normally we tend to say our children, okay, go to school, learn well, if you get educated, you will manage to succeed. Here you can see this is the worst thing that we can say to our children. Best thing would be, don't go to school, don't learn so much, because the more you learn, the more discriminated you're going to be in the end. Look at the turquoise one. There you can see the numbers for the youth with without migration background on the left-hand side from your comparison. So it's like, I can't see the numbers from here, something about 50% who are invited for, or who are transiting into vocational training. And then look at the far right one, also the turquoise one, which is really literally half of that. So 50% less are your chances when you have Abitur, which is like high school education. If you are doing the lower secondary education, your chances are nearly equal, which is the green one. There is not so much discrimination if you are in the lower scales. The higher you rise, the higher is the anti-immigrant discourse. And this is also a very counterintuitive moment we are facing. This is so far that we are now doing empirical studies with the hypothesis that it is effectively the integration of the immigrants that is leading to fear of the people. And this is something which, of course, sounds counterintuitive. We made up a hypothesis on that, calling it out-group mobility threat. So the moment where the out-group faces mobility and comes into your realm, this is the moment where you feel the real danger. Because as long as they were outside, or as long as it were those women cleaning up women wearing headscarf, we had no debates on headscarf in Germany. We started to have these debates when the first woman with a headscarf wanted to become a teacher. So there you can see that the discourses are very much connected to the uprising of immigrants. Another thing which also is depressing, I think, is this was a study from our institute, from my colleagues. They did experimental studies with teachers and could prove that from first grade on, there is a systematic disadvantage for students from first grade on for students with a Turkish name. And it doesn't matter if they are from very educated families, if their parents are whatsoever rich doctors or millionaires whatsoever, very educated, it doesn't matter. It is enough to have a Turkish name in order for the teachers to expect less from them. They just expect less. So what is the effect? If they expect less, there is less data for interaction, and there is less teachers calling on the students. And the interaffections effects and the calling out of them leads to the fact that also in reality, the cognitive abilities of these children decline. They did cognitive tests before, so they did mathematic tests with these children, and then they asked the teachers, would you think that these children named whatsoever Gültekin would manage? And then teachers systematically to them with a Turkish name would say, no, they would not manage this cognitive test. But then we had these tests in advance. So this is where we could show that, and we published that in Germany last year, and there was a big mourning about that, and there were there was a lot of debate about that in the news. But we didn't do that in order to say bad racist German teachers. It was only because we thought that raising awareness on this side would somehow make it possible for teachers to have to just have a look at themselves in their classes, to really prove whether they interact less or whether they call less on the Turkish students. Okay, I'm coming to the end because I want to make up a picture in the end, an integration picture. So what I showed you data, structural data on the labor market and education. Here I'm showing you social and cultural and emotional kind of discrimination, which is also a study that we did at our institute and published on them. We wanted to show whether integration is really affecting people's minds. So, there's normally two measurements on integration that are crucial in the German debate. And one of them is civic engagement, and the other one is education. So they tell you, if you want to belong, what you have to show is that you are able to get educated, and if you want to belong even more, show civic education. And this resonates somehow. You think people want to do something for the new community, they come into it, they want to be part of it, they learn the language and things like that. And so we tested that. We made a testing where we had two different names. The names were Ibrahim and Stefan, and with the phone calls we manipulated Ibrahim and Stefan constantly throughout the phone calls. So once we said Ibrahim or Stefan had very low secondary education or low education or no education, they were Muslims or Christians, they were working with elderly people, or they were working in a mosque. So we had different informations like this. And what I brought you here is the information of the best outcome you can give to someone, like Ibrahim and Stefan being very well educated, having passed Abitur, so high school proficiency, and working on a vocational basis in a home for elderly people. So everything what you think might sound nice, we had that, and then we could see no matter how we framed Ibrahim or Stefan, in this moment where we gave the code, they are Muslims, 30% of the people would not want them to be part of their family. And this is what then is so contradictory to the political idea and to the public narrative. Oh, we're not against them. If they show us that they want to be part, we would accept. So, but then we showed them they are part, but still 30% would say, no, no. But actually, you know what? The next question we had, would you agree in Ibrahim and Stefan, we had one of cleaning up your house, and we had the other one of helping you in the house with your parents, like, I don't know, I say, caring about your parents. There, this was accepted. So as carekeepers, it was more accepted, but being a member of your family, being one of your own, this is something that 30% of the people would say, no, we don't want that. Okay, so what could we prove with our studies? We could prove a very contradictory, ambivalent moment where we could see that asking the people, they would, on a very abstract level, acknowledge diversity, democracy. They would say that, of course, they know about these rules and they think that they are right. And they would say, for example, in this case, nearly 70% would say if Muslims ask for their rights, they are acting according to the rules. So this is okay. So, or some, I can't read it very well. Muslim making demands for diversity are acting in their rights. So people, there you can see, cognitively understood that minorities have the rights to make demands. 70% would say yes, which is quite a high number. And we have the same numbers. Other colleagues of mine have a diversity barometer, integration barometer, and they always show that on a cognitive level, the German society can accept diversity and democratic rules and pluralism. But as soon as it becomes concrete, we can see, have these 70% in mind, as soon as it becomes concrete, for example, concerning religious laws and the right to practice your religion, 60% of the German population would prohibit circumcision, and 50% would not allow teachers to wear a headscarf, and 40% would say that mosques should not be constructed if they are visible. So, and you might know, I mean, you might be aware that constructing a place of worship is a basic idea, a fundamental idea of democratic constitutions. And 40% is really high numbers. Okay, we might end here and say, as I started off, if it's only about sentiments, so what? As long as people have good hospitals in Germany, as long as we have good schools and good roads, that should be enough. But we can see that what I mentioned before, this erosion of democracy is really taking place. And if we asked people, or this is something my colleagues from Leipzig did, and nearly 60% of the German population would say Muslims and their religion are so different from us that it would be naive to grant them same access to all societal positions. But granting same access to all societal positions is a major pillar of democracy. If you think that you can grant societal positions according to sameness, then all societal positions would be reserved for male people for all of our lives. But the idea is about and this is what I want you to take out from here, we are not a multicultural society in Germany. We don't claim this, like being based on multicultural policy. And people, especially the right-wing people, say this is all very modern ideas, maybe coming from Canada or from different places that have always been countries of immigration. We have not always been a country of immigration, so these ideas are new to us and they don't fit our narrative. But indeed, I would want you to take out with you that this is not about multiculturalism. It is about democracy. Because it's not multiculturalism that is rooted in our constitution. Our constitution is based on pluralism in 5 major pillars. The first one, which is our first article, is about, was heißt Würde auf Dignity, yes. It's about dignity, and it says that the dignity of all people should be respected. It doesn't say the dignity of all Germans should be respected. So it is already based in the idea of everyone being equal. And then it goes ahead, and then we have one article, which is Article 3, and this article is based on equality, and it says that no one should be treated unequal because of his or her race, gender, sexual identity, religion, and so on. So this is the third article. The fourth one is about religious rights. And the fifth one is about Meinungsfreiheit. Freedom of speech. So all of these, all of these are major moments of pluralism. It's pluralism, and pluralism is rooted in our constitution. We don't have to call that multiculturalism. We can call it like it was called in 1949 when this constitution was constructed. This would already be enough. Then we can get to whatever, diversity and so on. But first, let's start with accepting what is written down there. And what is written down there, and this is Article 3, that no one can be treated unequal because people think that he's different. Okay, to sum up and to conclude and to end with a kind of a policy strategy, maybe for the discussion, what I was showing you was about challenges for integration. And normally in social sciences, we try to measure everything, and we measure integration, as I showed you before, in these 4 different fields, like structural integration, social integration, cultural integration, and that what we can call emotional integration or identification. And I showed you clearly for all of these fields that all of these fields are being denied to immigrants, and especially to Muslim persons, even being them immigrants or not. They can be there for the 3rd or 4th generation, but as I showed you, it's enough to have the name. So I showed you the structural exclusion and discrimination in the job market and education. I showed you the cultural exclusion by denying religious right. I showed you the social exclusion while not accepting as family members. And I can talk later about the identificative exclusion, which is not being part of the national narrative. To conclude with that, what we can see, and I described it before, is that there is a so-called normative paradox in society that says yes to diversity, but no to Muslims, refugees, people of color, Roma, whatsoever. And this mismatch of one norm that you think that you have internalized, and your reaction towards it when it becomes concrete is something that we can call a normative paradox, and this causes ambivalences and rising post-factualities. What we also can see is that there is a gap between cognitive acceptance and an emotional distance at the same time. And this is causing backlashes in the public debate, because once you think you have that accepted cognitively, suddenly you always see when it becomes concrete emotionally, there is this backlash. And what we can see, of course, is that there is a lack of knowledge concerning democratic principles. People think they are Democrats, but they don't know what democracy means. And they don't know how difficult democracy is and that we have to fight for it every day. And I'm sure people are not so aware about these constitutional facts that I have said. But if you raise that knowledge, there is this, they really think this is a new idea that came from outside, this accepting multicultural diversity. They don't know that it is rooted in the society itself. And what I wanted to show you is that there is an omnipresent migration narrative, and that this omnipresent migration narrative somehow is invisibilizing underlying social problems that are related to race, for example, and to racism. We don't talk about racism in Germany. We talk about migration. So this is something that has to change. And ending with some policy strategies that we might talk about, this normative paradox that I said, the first thing is to recognize it. The first thing is to recognize that it's not enough to just claim for being a Democrat. And the first thing is to understand that there is a democratic erosion. And there is a moment that we have to unveil that the idea that we as as Europeans have from ourselves of being democratic, tolerant, open-minded, maybe somehow clashes with the realities outside. When there is a deal with a Turkish president turning into an autocrat, or when there are people dying in the Mediterranean Sea that might somehow contradict our ideas of ourselves. First, we have to accept that. It's not in order to get into deep depression, but it's mainly only understanding it, then we might be able to turn into policymaking in order to know how we could change that and in order to get out of this binary code construction. The next one would be rising democratic knowledge. I think Germany is facing that right now. There is a lot of money put into rising democratic knowledge. Within the past years, they noticed that there were 2 states, Bavaria and Saxonia, that have lowered all their funding on money for political knowledge on democracy. And this is exactly the 2 states where we had the highest amounts of rising xenophobia and racism within the past years. So this, in fact, has been a policy change that is now taking place in Germany. And I would say what we would need for Europe, and I worked on that with a group of people in Germany, and we advised policymakers on that we would say what we would need is a kind of a mission statement for Germany, which should be aspirative, which should look to the way where we want to get to, and not always look to the past by repeating reconstructive ideas on the so-called Leitkultur, which has been a strong debate within the past 20 years in the German debates, or 18 years. So what we would want to go for, and there, Charlie, I would like to convince you, because we are looking very much forward to bring the political realm and the political parties into the idea of constructing a so-called joint integration contract. And our claim is Integration für alle, which means integration for everybody. And that would take the integration debate out of the connection to migration and would bring us to those moments to understand that integration as a tool in fact is something that is connected to structures, to cultural achievements, to not only economic parts, but also to social and emotional developments for everybody, be you German or be your ancestry German or whatsoever. It doesn't really matter where you came from. It's the matter where you want to head to. And I think as a society, we should give us this idea and this ideal of becoming a truly integrative democracy. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foroutan. That was wonderful. Now I'll invite you to take a seat, and I will invite Senator Omitvar to join Dr. Foroutan for a highly anticipated conversation about pluralism, populism, nation building in an uncertain age of migration. Thank you.
Thank you. That was everything I promised the audience. You have shifted the way I think about integration, because let's admit here in Canada, integration is a public good. Good integration makes us feel better. In Germany, good integration leads to feelings of insecurity and fear. I find that fascinating, but let's also agree that we have similarities as well. You talked about your research in names and biases resulting from strangeness of names. We have more or less the same results from empirical studies here. If your name is John Smith, you're 60% more likely to be included in, to be called back for an interview, as opposed to, let's say, your name is Naika Foroutan. And on that note, I should ask Naika to tell everyone the story about how we know each other.
Yes, this is really a good story, because actually we know each other for more than 40 years.
Yes.
And we know each other from Tehran, where Ratna was living and is a friend of my mom, who is also here somehow. Ah, there she is. And we used to play in Ratna's garden because she had a swimming pool. and in times where my mom had to work, she sometimes left us there. And I remember I was always looking up Ratna's photos, and she was showing photos where she, from her wedding, and she had a lot of gold. And I was always asking, because this was the typical form, I think, of gifts for the marriage. And she always told me, one day you also will look like that and have this gold, but you have to marry an Indian man.
Which she didn't. So let's.
But you also didn't.
I didn't. So 6 degrees of separation here, I should admit. And it's wonderful to be back in touch with Naika as a peer, which is, you know, how I think of you. Let's ask you to reflect for a moment, not on on deconstructing populism as you know it in Germany and in Europe, but populism in North America. Do you discern substantive differences, or is it the same? Insecurity, loss of white-collar jobs, concerns about national identity. Is it the same discourse, or is it a little different because this is North America, supposed to be, you know, the home of the free world, et cetera, et cetera?
Actually, I can't say anything about the Canadian cause because I'm really not familiar with that. But I remember when I've been here in June, there was a lot of debate about also a party rising up here, working with very similar narratives on spreading fear, and on this very narrative, or that there is one person who is really hearing the voice of the people. And there is very much this idea connected to the elites that are not concerned about public and about population ideas. This is something which is very similar. But the U.S.-American narrative, and I told you before, there's been a huge debate on a book from Mark Lilla on the failing of the Democrats. And this is explicitly connected to the idea that the liberal Democrats have lost because they were so much into diversity issues, and they were much more involved into same gender toilets than being involved with the working class people. So this has been a best-selling book in the USA and the US, and a lot of liberals felt very guilty about that and really went into this trap. And actually, this is a very public, very, very prominent debate in Germany too. Social Democrats are using the same narrative now. That's coming out and say, oh, we turned too much postmodern. We really put too much emphasis on the climate change. What I'm saying is a real quote of Sigmar Gabriel, at that time being the head of the Social Democrats, coming out in a huge newspaper article saying the failure of the Social Democrats was that we put too much effort and we heard too much into climate change and into same-sex marriages, and we forgot about the working class people. And the interesting thing here is that this argument, it resonates so well, and you think that you have to give them right, and everyone thinks and feels guilty. But then, if we deconstruct it, we can see that the labor cause, the working class people in Germany, I don't know how it is here, are mainly comprised by immigrants. So it's the immigrants who, by 80%, are working class people. So if you come out with a diversity narrative, you also hit the working class people in reality. Or the gender narrative. Those people in Germany who are highest affected by poorness is a single mom with a child, a single mom. So there you can see that the gender argument is deeply connected with the argument of poorness, of working. We don't have to have this race, gender, and class division lines separated, how the Social Democrats are. They're concentrating very much on class, leaving race and gender behind, and telling that race and gender arguments are identity politics, while at the same time the class is a total identity politics as well. Especially the right-wing populism is based on identity politics, but it's mainly based on the white identity. And there, no one deconstructed it as identity politics. They say, okay, they could manage to get into it because they heard to the working class. I think this is something that should be reconnected again. And I don't know how this is the case in Canada.
Well, I think we are particularly interested in the experiences from Germany and, of course, from North America, because I will suggest to the audience that we are not immune from these forces. In fact, there is research to tell us, and there is the rise of political narrative here too that is similar to what is happening in other parts of the world, but it is somewhat contained. And partly, I want to ask you a question, and I'm really curious about this. In Canada, we have debates that rise up every now and then and are now continuing with a referendum in British Columbia about proportional representation. The political structure of our country is such that we still have first past the post-election systems. And there is a rising crescendo of demands that we should have proportional representation like Germany. And I wonder if proportional representation, in fact, leads to a political system that gives rise to the inclusion of right-wing parties or left-wing parties, whereas in Canada, it is, and this is the truth, there is no way a political party in Canada can get elected to a majority government if it is anti-immigrant, quite simply by virtue of our electoral arrangements, which give a lot of weight to seats in parliament that are drawn from heavily immigrant riding. So there's no way. Even we have not a single anti-immigrant party yet, with the exception of a splinter party, which, let's talk about Maxine Bernier a little later. I don't want to take over the debate here. But I just wonder, is proportional representation a function of, or is it a foundation that leads to a cacophony of voices on all sides of the debate, and therefore you have this problem? Should we be aware? Should we beware?
I mean, actually, if you have a look at UK, for example, we always had two dominant parties there. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party, the Tories there. And we still had they still had to face the Brexit. I mean, then they had UKIP, which is the far-right party, which didn't have been so much represented by voting numbers, but which had a high voice. And this is what we can see. The political realm is very much open to manipulations now through the internet, as we could see also for the voting elections in the US. And if people want to come out by that, and in the end, to be honest, I think it's better to know where your enemy is. And if you have your enemy and you can spot him and you can see him, it's better than turning their arguments into arguments of the Social Democrat or the Conservative Party. And this can always happen. And therefore, actually, because in Germany we're so much into federalism that we cannot even imagine that it would work out differently. But of course, every country has its own system to deal with.
We watch this. So I'm going to ask one, I hope, last question, although I have many others. And we want to go to the audience. We want lots of audience participation. So I want to ask you a question that worries me a bit. Does Canada coast? I looked at your numbers. 1 point, how many million refugees? Let's be absolutely frank here. As much as we like our reputation as, a country of compassion, how many refugees finally did come in the height of 2016? If I know my numbers correctly, it was 50,000. There is no way this country would have the appetite, I believe, for 1 point something million. So do we coast on our history and geography? Is that your perception, that we talk a good line but don't necessarily walk it?
Well, I would not say it in such a harsh way. But actually, I would say Canada has the narrative. But we Germans could have the policy for it. So I think we don't have the narrative. And it's like, actually, well, for me to come here, we come from social welfare states. I think this is a huge achievement of mankind to think about things like that. And I think if we look into German social theory, I remember a few years ago, I've been to Ellis Island in New York, and there is this migration museum. And this was really fascinating to me because you can see about every immigrant group that migrated to the US, what changed, what did they bring with them, and there was this story, and I was going that along, and then I arrived to 1820, 30, and there was this idea, this description, and it said, and then the Germans came. And it was so interesting because it was connected to strikes, to building up working unions, to gender rights, and to all these kinds of social change that the Germans brought with them, and which is very deeply rooted into German social theory. I mean, if you go to the New School in New York, which is this school on social sciences, they all read Germans. Because, you know, even all the Marxist ideas, all the ideas of equality, they are rooted into this German thought. And I think this is a very big cultural heritage that this country has. And they forget about it. A lot of times they forget when they want to say, we want a new immigration law, they look to Canada in order to copy it. But the Canadian law is so utilitarian, and it's so neoliberal, and it doesn't fit us. We have not been neoliberal. We're turning, of course, into a neoliberal country also, but we have deeply rooted ideas of social societies. And I always wonder why they do not have the idea of combining, and actually this is a good German thing. We're always very late in a lot of things. We look to others and say, oh, they did it very well. But our lateness makes it possible to look at the failures of the others and then decide to not make the same thing. And I think,
wise.
yes, this is quite wise. And I think if we look at the immigration laws of Canada, and combine them with our idea of social policy, this could really turn out into made in Germany, very good thing.
And we could learn from you. So we're going to go to the floor for questions. And whilst the first candidate for a question is standing up, let me ask you a personal question. Naika, you are a member of the German elite. I have lived in Germany, and I know if you're an academic, you're completely top drawer. You're married to a German, you have children. How do you experience this populism on a personal level, or is it simply abstract for you?
Well, actually, because I am very much in the public debate for years now. And as everybody who is in this debate, I receive a lot of hate mails, and I am confronted with, like, every time I say something, there's these letters coming into my office. And, you know, my strategy actually is to not read them. My poor secretary, she's reading them all. And the only thing I said, I want her to send me the good letters.
Okay, so we'll send her good letters from this audience. Okay, over to the audience. Questions. I think there's a mic roving. Please don't hesitate, especially students. This is an event for students and for older students as well. That's all right. There.
Sorry. Hi. So my question is regarding the policy strategy of spreading democratic knowledge and what democracy means. But before, when the numbers you gave about the rise of right-wing populism, the argument was that actually knowledge is not the matter here, because even though the numbers don't correspond with the narratives they have, the right-wing populism is still rising. So how does that go together?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was maybe what I meant by the first knowledge was the data. We really have the experience that empirical data doesn't change people's perception. And this is something that we have to acknowledge for quite a few years. And so what we try to do is combining empirical data with narratives, with storytelling, to somehow put that into different forms of knowledge. And I think democracy as a tool for knowledge is not only about stand up and tell me the 20 amendments of our constitutions or the 20 rights, but it's mainly about knowing how difficult democracy is. And about that moment that you always have to engage for that. You know, we see that also in the feminist movement, for example. On 12th of October, we're going to have the moment where we're going all to celebrate 100 years voting rights for women, 100 years. But within this development, our countries thought that feminism or gender equality issues are somehow solved, that we all have internalized it, it is part of our rule, and we think it would go ahead like this. And as a matter of fact, this latest parliament, as I told you before, is the parliament with the lowest number of women since more than 20 years in the German history. It wasn't that we were going and heading towards equality, but we left this fight. We thought it's going ahead. We didn't pose the knowledge on that. And we didn't make it part of our everyday achievement. And what we are facing now is really a rollback. And with democracy, it's the same. It's not only about teaching democracy in political classes, but it's about making it an everyday experiment and about showing where the failures are. This is mainly what I mean by rising knowledge on that. And we have concepts on that also in our teaching. And this is what we even have a kind of a ministry for that, that is now really doing that in kind of town hall meetings, in kind of textbooks for children, in interactive matters, really experimenting new forms of showing how democracy feels.
My name is Ahmed Duranai. I'm an immigrant from Afghanistan, and I have lived here in Canada for 32 years. I would like to make a small comment and add a question to it, to Naika Foroutan. The way I see it, democracy, there is a lot of talk about democracy, but the way I see it is that democracy is not really the rule of the people. It's the rule of an articulate minority that rules the people. And usually it's either a left wing or a right wing or somewhere in the center. And what happens is that currently, because of globalism or globalization, the left wing and the liberal have lost the ability to win the hearts and minds of the majority of the people. And that's why populism is on the rise. Do you think your study shows like that or not? And is it a fight for perception or for facts? Because most of the time, facts really don't matter in politics. It's the perception. And that fight for perception and the hearts and minds, currently, the right wing is winning. And that's why populism is on the rise. I would like to know your opinion on that one. Thank you.
Actually, I totally agree. I agree, but I'm not so sure because of the wording of hearts and minds, because this is where we can all see that we are losing our words, because hearts and minds in the construction of philosophy is not so much connected to evilness, to hatred, things like that. Normally, we would not place so much hatred in connection with heart and mind. It's like Arundhati Roy once said, we have to fight back. We have to fight for our words. And she said that when the word democratization was being connected to the war in Iraq. So the invasion of Iraq by that time Bush administration was not called an invasion. It was called a democratization of that country. And she said, if we don't get our words back, one day democracy will not have any value any longer. And what you were saying also, that the right-wing populism goes into the hearts and minds. What is difficult and what we actually have to understand is how come that negative feelings and negative sentiments somehow seem to be so thriving, and what makes it attractive to rise hatred? Of course, we know that rising hatred at this very moment leads to higher votes. But and we also can see that those who now seem to be attractive for people are those who come out with words that we even couldn't have imagined a few years ago that people would say. Like, let's think about the American president. No one would have expected that someone who comes out talking about women in that way and having a video where he says, you got to grab them by the pussy, 2 weeks later is going to be a president of the most important country in the world. So obviously, there is this moment where people somehow feel that they want to say things not in a politically correct way. And this what we have understood as diversity lines. We had a talk today about language, about how to deal with each other in more sensitive ways. This seems to make some people aggressive. And we have to understand why. Actually, I can't tell you why. I don't know why. I just can tell you something that we have been facing for the last years, and maybe this could be an explanation, is that what we know is that there has been a constantly rising norm and knowledge on the idea of what democracy could be. So democracy as a normative construction is connected to sameness and to equality. And then on the other side, you can see that a lot of people realize that there is no equality and there is no sameness. And then you have this tremendous mismatch. You know what democracy should be, and you know that our societies are failing constantly. And this huge mismatch between norm and empirical reality causes stress. This stress is caused because this is a cognitive dissonant moment. And then you have two possibilities to get away with this cognitive dissonance. You put a lot of resources in order to make the empirical reality reach your norm, but then therefore you need quota, you need more money put into social justice, you need welfare states, whatsoever. You need these resources. The other thing in order to get away with the cognitive dissonance is lowering the norm. And this is what we are facing now. And this is what the right wing can play on very good. They lowered the norm. The moral majority in our societies has become right. So people acting in this field of norms now are no longer acting in a cognitively dissonant mode. They are acting according to the norm that we have placed in societies right now. And we have to get out of this trend of making this our new norm.
New norm, yeah. Is not part of the issue that populism lends itself to easy, simplistic, jingoistic slogans? Build a wall, drain the swamp, stop the queue jumping. It fights with the complexity of reality, of pluralism. Do you think we have to find our own slogans, or should we frame our ideas and admit that complexity is part of our world?
I think this is absolutely right, and I think it took our parties, it took them time to understand, because we can see, as I showed you before, all those parties who tried to imitate the right-wing slogans failed. The Social Democrats throughout Europe has failed within the last year because they wanted to understand the fear of the people and made them somehow common with their ideas. And I'm doing that really a lot. And I think, this critique of elites that we are facing now, there is this idea of Gramsci, which is very much connected to the idea of everyone can be an intellectual. And this is a very important idea. It was a very leftist idea. And he wrote about the, about the real intellectual and its function for society. And he said that everyone, like a mother could be an intellectual to her child, or a community speaker could be an intellectual to his or her community, and that we have to somehow be aware that rising knowledge can work in different ways, can work verbally, can work emotionally. And this critique of elites that we are facing is especially a critique that we see in a lot of totalitarian societies. The first thing they eliminate is the elite. But because now we think of elite as someone or is a group of people which is disconnected to others, which effectively is not the position of elites if you read Gramsci. But what I want to say to that is I noticed very much in my talks that people honor, and I have this feedback because I'm doing a lot of public talks, like really town hall meetings, or talking to people in sports clubs or with teachers, and I always tell them I'm not going to reduce my language.
Okay.
I'm going to explain what I say, but I'm not going to reduce it. I use words that might be complex, like the normative paradoxon or the cognitive dissonance, but I explain it, and I have a lot of feedback of people coming in telling me, thank you for taking me serious. And this is something that I would like to tell that to the people who are trying with politics, reducing this complexity, and thinking that they have to change their talks in order to be understood. And they're not taking the people serious, because people actually acknowledge this.
Let's embrace complexity. There were more questions. Harold, is that okay?
Yeah,
more questions? Yeah.
I wondered whether you noticed any change in the younger generation in Germany with their attitudes to migration at universities, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much for this good question. Actually, concerning the younger people, 37% of our children going to school until 18 have a so-called migration background. And we have cities like Frankfurt with 70% of the children going to school having a so-called migration background. We have Berlin, Hamburg, etc., with 50%, 48%. So to them, we might think that diversity has become normality, which in some kind, yes, but as I said before, and this is also something we have to be aware of, it's not a question of numbers. You know, we have always been 50% women in the world, but we gained our right for voting 100 years ago. So it's not a question of numbers. It's a question of public recognition and political recognition. And until the political recognition, unless it's not there in the public realm, we can have as many children as we want with a migration background. This will not change the perception. Children there are naming themselves in terms of foreigners. And they call themselves foreigners. They do it proudly, but they call themselves foreigners, even though they don't know about any other country besides Germany. But they say, I'm a foreigner. They only have the German passport, but they call themselves foreigners. So this is part of the reality that we have to acknowledge, and we have to understand how to deal with that.
Maybe we can take one more question, Harold? One more?
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Ola Muhajir. My question is concerning a challenge that I'm facing in trying to understand where your policy recommendations fit with respect to what kind of impact it can actually have. And so after like a quick myopic bout of thinking just to myself, I was thinking, well, we see many countries around the world that have democratic principles and they tout them very proudly and widely. You can take the United States, for example. We do the same thing here, yet you still find high rates of racism and populism in countries that do have a very forceful projection of their democratic principles. So I'm having trouble seeing the disconnect between doing something like a gentle reminder of here's what we actually stand for, and then having an impact show itself in society. And the reason why I also see this is because as a Canadian, I see what we tout. And it's not that we tout our democratic principles, In fact, now in the halls of the United Nations, we are touting diversity and inclusion. And if I think of, so my parents and I were asylum seekers, but I came to school, I did my primary school here. And part of my schooling, and a vivid image I remember, is when I was, this must have been in grade school, but what we were taught was, in Canada, we are a tapestry. We have like a mosaic. And so you'll see each piece very different, but at the end of the day, it's going to make a beautiful carpet. And I know it sounds simple, but to teach a child from that very young age that we are a diverse nation, we're each gonna look different, we're each gonna fit together differently, but at the end of the day, we're going to be this beautiful. It was not a conversation about democratic principles. It was a conversation of values. So then this brings me to the other part of my identity, which is based in the Arab world. But when I went to school also in Lebanon, and I was verifying with my Palestinian friend here, we have a class called Tarbiyah, which is like a class about manners, basically. And it teaches values to children. And we don't have anything like that here, but it's still being taught by the example that I gave with the carpet. So I'm wondering, I guess I'm having trouble seeing how talking about democratic principles and having that be a reminder to a society will actually yield the impacts that you want to see for the German people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really a very interesting question. I think I'm developing that in times where we know that trying to get to the people with norms and values debates has become very, very difficult. Explicitly, people are fighting that back. If you want to talk to them about nice images, or if you want to talk to them about diversity or multiculturalism, this is called, I can't transport this word into English, but this is called Gutmenschendiskurs. I don't know if anyone knows how to translate that.
Discourse about
but
good people.
Yeah, like naive discourse of good people who don't know how the real world is and who want to impose their politically correct thoughts on us who are the real population. And therefore, the best thing is, people somehow are proud to say that they don't like multiculturalism, that they are proud to say that they don't want diversity and that they have the major right. But they are not proud at all to be called anti-democrats. So in the end, within their image, you can catch them better if you go into the democracy issue. But maybe this is different from country to country, I think. Well, in the German debate, there is something that is called Verfassungspatriotismus, which means patriotism on the basic of constitution. We don't have patriotism as a value concept in the German debate because of a lot of things, but mainly because of history. So patriotism and the wording for that, it's not placed in the public realm. So therefore they say, if you want to be a real patriot, be that on the base of the Constitution and not on the base of a, how do you say, flag, or on the base of other things that make the nation become a nation. So the idea that I have is mainly for a cognitive concept of a society that deals very well with cognitive issues, but as I showed you before, there is a lack of emotion. Maybe we should try to do that mainly on that basis, also because we have so many people with a so-called migration background who would want to be an effective part of society, an emotional part of society, and not only a technical part of society. And I think this would be a good idea. And actually, it is also starting in school books like this, but it's a way to go there. And actually, nowadays, reaching out with these words brings us in a bad position. All our words are gone. we have to reinvent new words in order to get there. Everything that we were used to say, and I could tell you a lot of German words that don't fit into the public debate now. We don't know when did they happen that our words lost weight. Maybe because we had all these beautiful concepts, but the reality was different. So this mismatch also took away our words. And now I think the way to start could be a cognitive moment by remembering people on the basis when they started in 1949 constructing their country after World War II. This basis was the Constitution. And then we should fill in emotional patterns too.
Over to you, Harold.
Okay, I'd like to thank you, Professor Foroutan, for a fascinating talk, and Senator Ahmedvar for an insightful discussion afterwards. I'm very glad that we were able to establish a German-Canadian dialogue on migration and integration, and I think we're all looking forward to continuing this dialogue in the future. I'd like to thank, at the end, our co-organizer, Kim Turner, and the Global Diversity Exchange, Igor Rosic, who's standing here at the side, who is the program administrator of the graduate program in Immigration and Settlement Studies. Also, I'd like to thank Shreen Williams, who has played a major part in pulling all this together. Our partners, 6 Degrees and the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, the German Consulate Toronto, also the Goethe Institute Toronto, and the Ted Rogers School of Management for providing these facilities. And of course, we had a dozen or so volunteers who are also in the graduate program of Immigration and Settlement Studies. Without the volunteers, we couldn't have had this event tonight. We hope to see you all at the next annual GDX lecture. If you're interested in applying to the Immigration and Settlement Studies graduate program, online admissions are open. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you have a safe trip home.